All right, well, this is great. Lots of participants. I'm so happy. All righty. All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Joy Ellen Williams. It is so good to see you this morning. Welcome to our virtual Coffee with a Curator program. If it's your first time attending, wow, thank you so much for being here and making time for this. If you've been attending and you're a seasoned attendee, I can't tell you how much I appreciate you being here every week. Thank you so much. I would like to say a big happy birthday to our wonderful colleague, Maggie Thomas. Maggie, can you raise your hand, please? Yay, happy birthday, Maggie. So please do wish her a happy birthday in the chat if you like.
I wasn't expecting that. Thank you.
So excited for you, Maggie. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you today from Kennesaw State University, which is built upon and surrounded by the lands of several Native American tribes and nations, namely the Muskogee Creek people and the Cherokee Nation. Members of these tribes and nations were forcibly removed from their land in the 19th century through a government-sanctioned tragedy we now call the Trail of Tears. I want to acknowledge the injustice and oppression faced by these Indigenous groups, and I'd also like to acknowledge the resilience and cultural vibrancy of the Cherokee and Creek people who continue to play a vital role in the United States today. So happy November and happy Native American and Indigenous Heritage Month. I think you're going to love our program today as we celebrate the culture, the tradition, and the lives of Indigenous and Native American people in this country. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge Miriam already knew that Andrew was at New Echota today. So that is so exciting. We always have a where's Andrew, always trying to figure out where he is, but our expert knew, so that is so exciting. As usual, Andrew has placed information about New Echota or whatever place he's in. He always makes a wonderful handout for us. So that is in the chat at the top if you would want to go ahead and download that and give you some great information about it. So again, this is going to be a wonderful program. And since we are celebrating Native American and Indigenous Heritage Month, I would just like to give you a little bit of background about this commemorative time. This nationally recognized day really dates back to about 1990. There were many efforts before then, but November became the nationally recognized time to celebrate Native American and Indigenous heritage under President George H.W. Bush. In the words of current U.S. Secretary of the Interior, Deb Haaland, the goal of this month is to honor the gifts of Indigenous ancestors by celebrating Indigenous knowledge, traditions, language, and culture. And I have a link for you all. I'm going to put it in the chat. There are a lot of different events that take place and really interesting, I think, webinars and whatnot. So you can visit nativeamericanheritage.gov for more information. I think recently, actually on Monday evening, there was a conversation between U.S. Secretary Deb Haaland, Joy Harjo, U.S. Poet Laureate, and Carla Hayden, Library of Congress. So that sounded amazing. So I'm hoping that was recorded. So there are a lot of different events that are taking place. And all right, I just shared the link in the chat. So feel free to take a look at that. Finally, I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Miriam Brown Spiers. Miriam, can you raise your hand? All right, there she is. Wonderful. So excited. We're so excited to have you here. And I just want to share a bit about you to those who may not be as familiar with who you are and your work. I'd like to read your bio. Miriam Brown Spiers is an assistant professor of English and interdisciplinary studies at KSU, where she also coordinates the Native American and Indigenous Studies program. Her teaching and research areas include Native American literature, the Native South, and Indigenous science fiction and comics. She lives in Kennesaw with her husband and son, 3 cats, and a pandemic puppy. So welcome. We are so happy to have you. So Miriam, I think without further ado, I'll have you take it away. And Miriam, just let me know, how would you like, would you like this to be where people can, if they have a question, how should they put it in the chat? How would you like this to go?
Thank you. So I think people should definitely feel open to interrupting with questions. You can raise your hand or put it in the chat. I will say I'm going to share a PowerPoint, which does not mean you can't interrupt me. It just means, Joy Ellen, I might need your help to let me know if you see questions coming through.
Absolutely. I will monitor the chat for you. You don't have to worry about that.
But I would much rather have a conversation. So anytime you have a question, please just jump in.
Wonderful. Yay.
All right. Are we ready?
We are ready. Thank you so much.
All right. I'm going to go ahead and make sure I can actually share my screen. Here we go. And okay, can everybody see that?
We can.
Awesome, thank you. So thank you all so much for coming out this morning. I know by this point in the semester, especially, everybody is really busy on campus, and I appreciate your time and your interest. And thank you again to Joy Ellen for inviting me today. So one of the reasons that Joy Ellen has asked me to talk to you all, besides the fact that it is Native American and Indigenous Heritage Month, is that my book on Indigenous science fiction is actually coming out next month. And so this is the cover of the book, which I am very excited about. The artist for this book is a Cherokee artist named, or for the cover, sorry, is a Cherokee artist named Roy Boney. And this is, the cover art is a reference to a famous picture of Sequoia. So the folks who have been to New Echota might be familiar with Sequoia, but he's responsible for creating the Cherokee syllabary, so the Cherokee written language. And there's this famous painting of him wearing a turban and smoking a pipe. So Roy Boney's artwork is Sequoiazilla, which just delights me to no end. So anyway, today I would like to talk about what Indigenous science fiction is and why it's such an exciting genre. And so I'm going to begin by talking about the 2 pieces here separately, Native American literature and then science fiction, and then kind of talk about what happens at the intersections, what happens when you put those 2 things into conversation with each other. And I'll just say again, please feel free to jump in with questions at any point. I don't want to just lecture at you. So to get started at the very beginning, and forgive me if these are things that you all already know, but I want to just define some of the basic terms because I see a lot of conversation around which terms to use and what's offensive and what's appropriate. And so there are 3 terms that I'm going to be using that are all totally academically appropriate. The first is American Indian. So this is an older term. It's still the legally accepted term in many contexts. American Indian law relies on that word. We still talk about Indian territory when we're talking about reservations. And I think probably most folks know that that term comes from Christopher Columbus's belief that he had landed in the Indies. He was obviously wrong about that, but the term stuck. And some Native people prefer that term because they would like to see the history of colonization acknowledged. They would like to see that we continue to use that term rather than trying to sort of make it more politically correct or hide it by changing the terminology that we're using now. And that term also has really strong resonance for people from the 1960s and 70s. There was a Red Power activist movement, and one of the major organizations involved in that was called the American Indian Movement, or AIM. And so folks who were part of AIM or who have fond memories of AIM also want to retain the name there. So the other term, which is a little bit more recent, is Native American, and this is the one that we tend to see more often now. It's still referring to people in what is now the United States, but it's often seen as a little bit more polite or more academic, although again, both terms can be used. Some people don't like this term because they feel like it's kind of whitewashing history. It's pretending that all of the things that happened with the term American Indian didn't happen. And it also doesn't necessarily make sense because it doesn't make sense for people to be native to a country when they were here before that country existed, right? So even if we're going with the term American, it still is highlighting American identity and American nationality in a way that a lot of Native people don't identify with. Excuse me. And then finally, the newest and I think most popular academic term right now is Indigenous, which is a broader umbrella term. So it refers to people who are Indigenous to the places where they live all over the world. So we can talk about Indigenous peoples in Canada and Mexico and Australia and New Zealand, Indigenous peoples in Europe, Indigenous peoples all over. And this has sort of, it's a politically strategic term. It's kind of like saying people of color. It's a way to take a lot of groups who might individually be seen as really small minorities who don't have much of a voice and bring them together, unite them around common interests. And it's a way also to highlight the history of colonization that has affected people all over the world. So you'll see me using all three of those terms on and off, but I just wanted us to kind of all be on the same page. So, okay. With that in mind, I'll jump forward and we'll talk a little bit about what Native American literature actually is. And I know some of you who are here have had classes with me, so I apologize for you. This may be old information, but a lot of times people assume that when we say Native American literature, we're only talking about oral storytelling traditions, that we're only talking about creation stories or coyote stories or sort of fables that, you know, explain why the world is the way that it is. And those are really important. Those are absolutely at the core of much Native literary traditions, but that's not the extent of it. And so I think sometimes people are surprised to learn that Native literature exists well beyond just those stories that are hundreds or thousands of years old. So I will focus mostly today on contemporary literature, but just as a very brief kind of overview, there's early written literature by Native peoples and written in English, published in the 18th and 19th centuries. That includes sermons. There were Native American preachers. Excuse me, it includes newspaper editorials. As we know by looking at New Echota, there were the Cherokee had a newspaper beginning in the 1820s that was published in both English and in Cherokee, thanks to the syllabary. And so the editor was a Cherokee citizen. And so he was writing regular editorials. There are Native people writing letters back and forth to each other, people keeping diaries, people writing poetry, right? All of that kind of stuff was happening in the 18th and 19th centuries. And then beginning in the 1850s, we also have novels and stories and more poetry being written and published by Native people. Cherokee author John Rollin Ridge wrote the first Native American novel, which was published in 1854. It's called The Life and Times of Joaquin Murrieta. It's also, he actually lived in California, and it was the first novel by anyone published in California. And it's the basis for the Zorro stories that are still popular today. So from that point on, we've got Native people writing autobiographies, writing short stories, publishing in magazines, traveling the country and presenting their work. Basically, there is a robust literary movement. But it's sort of scattered. It's individual authors who aren't necessarily working together or in connection with each other until the 1960s, when we have a movement called the American Indian Literary Renaissance. And that movement really begins when Kiowa author N. Scott Momaday publishes Housemaid of Dawn, which wins the Pulitzer Prize in 1969. And texts from this era, from the late 60s and the 1970s, and they often focus on reclaiming and preserving American Indian identity and culture. And that was a really big deal at this point in time because Because by the 1970s, Native peoples had been facing cultural genocide and forced assimilation for hundreds of years. There had been many concerted efforts to wipe out their languages, their cultures, their religions, to take away their land. And so this was a really big deal that Native people, both in literature and art, but also in politics, were starting to push back at this point in time. So just as the civil rights movement and the second wave feminist movement were taking place, around the same time, you have this Red Power movement that's accompanied by the literature of the American Indian literary Renaissance. And so in a lot of ways, it's those books. One of the most famous is Leslie Marmon Silko's novel Ceremony. And you see these authors pushing back and saying, you know, American culture and Western culture are not always better than Indigenous cultures. They don't always know what to do. They're not always the best approach to the world. And so there's a real attempt to preserve the culture and respect the cultures, and really just be proud of what it means to be Native American. So that's kind of the beginning of what we would think of as the modern Native American literary movement. There we go. And from there we go to contemporary Native American literature. Excuse me. So by the 1980s and the 1990s, writers from the American Indian literary Renaissance are continuing to publish. But there's this kind of almost pan-Indian identity that has emerged, where there are sort of cultural markers that people associate with what it means to be Native American. American Indian Studies programs are appearing at colleges. The American government by this point has adopted a policy of self-determination, which recognizes that Native people have the right to govern themselves, to provide their own education, essentially to take control of their lives. And so thanks to these improvements, there are more Native authors emerging, and there's less pressure to always kind of tell this one story. And so people are telling different kinds of stories. They're beginning to experiment. They're doing essentially whatever they want to as authors, not necessarily because they have to represent all Native people in their literature. And so jumping ahead even further, by the early 21st century, Native American literature has really become a distinct field of study. There are people who are teaching it in colleges. There are books and anthologies being written about it. There's a recognition of a really diverse literary tradition. There's a reclaiming of some of these older authors, and also looking forward to what's coming next. One of the most important things that happens at this moment is that critics are calling for a tribally specific approach to the study of Native literatures. So that means, as opposed to pan-Indian, where you kind of lump all Native peoples together into a single identity and just assume that, like, if you've read one book by a Native author, you know what you need to know about Native American literature. Critics are saying, well, you know, a Cherokee author is going to have a very different perspective and worldview and language and religion and history than someone who is Navajo, someone who is Ojibwa, someone who is Laguna. And so when we're studying literature by these authors, we need to be looking more closely at their cultural contexts, at their historical contexts, and trying to come up with a literary lens that really reflects where each of these people is coming from and where their stories are coming from. So
Miriam,
this is kind of
a question.
Yes.
So
yes, please.
This is fascinating, and I'm going to need a copy of your PowerPoint. This is amazing. My question is, though, as I'm looking at these, I just feel so ignorant here because I'm looking through these periods. I was thinking back on when I was in high school, or even when I was in like in my college years. I just don't remember reading a lot of these authors, and I feel like, I mean, I think if anyone in high school, if we were going to read any Native American author, it was probably like Sherman Alexie, maybe. Yeah. But yeah. I'm just wondering, as this Renaissance was happening, were these authors and writers, were they joining the canon, I guess you could say, quote unquote, the canon? Was that happening at the same time?
That's a good question. So I would say a little bit, but maybe not as much as they ought to. a lot of what happened and what continues to happen is probably something that you've heard when people from other ethnic backgrounds try to be included. You get teachers saying that they don't feel equipped to teach those authors, that they feel like they don't know enough, which is kind of understandable if you think about this thing about being tribally specific, right? Like that's a lot of information. It's impossible to know all of it. And so people tend to feel a little overwhelmed and feel like they're not ready to present that, especially like in a high school class, but also even in a college classroom. And I think Alexi worked for a lot of people because he didn't necessarily require you to have all of that. But there are also problems with Sherman Alexi, who has gotten, essentially a lot of his behavior has been exposed by the Me Too movement. And so there's been a big push within Native literary studies not to teach Alexi, to try to replace him with someone else. I think Louise Erdrich is probably the person who gets taught most often after that. I would say, and I would say more of the poets tends to get brought in because it's easier to bring poets in. It's easier to like read a couple of poems and incorporate that into a syllabus. You know, a lot of Native literature is really challenging if you don't have any of that context. And so I think that's one reason that it sort of hovers on the edge of the canon in a lot of places. But I think it's still not taught as much as it ought to be. But there are, particularly for middle school and high school students, there are actually Native American YA novelists doing awesome work now, who fit more easily and who I think are being brought into the canon and into the classroom a little bit more.
Great, thank you so much.
Yeah. Thank you for that question. And truly, other people should feel free to jump in. And I promise we're going to get to the science fiction part in a minute. We're almost there. Okay, so anyway, by the 21st century, we have this move towards tribally specific approaches. And today there are hundreds of Native and Indigenous authors writing in so many different ways and experimenting in different ways. This, I know it's hard to read, but just to kind of get an idea, there's a Cherokee writer named Daniel Heath Justice who did what he called an Indigenous, a Native American literature Twitter project, where every day for a year in 2016, he used the hashtag honoring Indigenous writers and recommended a Native or Indigenous writer. So mostly from the US and Canada. And they've taken these, the Indigenous Literary Studies Organization took those names and turned them into this poster, just so that you can sort of see how many folks are out there. And there are some who are well known and some who are really obscure and some who are historical and many who are contemporary. And in his 2018 book, which is called Why Indigenous Literatures Matter, Justice did include an appendix with all of these authors and a list of what day of the year he recommended which author, basically. So if that's something you're curious about, the KSU library, I believe we actually have electronic access to this book, but I should double check that. So anyway, just to give you an idea that there is just this huge variety of work being done by Indigenous authors at this point in time. So for me, what I was really interested in is how we connect these Native literary traditions to European and then Euro-American literary traditions, because as I mentioned at the beginning, most Native cultures were originally oral cultures. They had oral storytelling rather than writing. They may have had some ways of recording things, but most of their stories were preserved orally. And storytelling itself is incredibly important in Indigenous cultures. It's a way of understanding and shaping the world that we live in. Cherokee writer Thomas King says, "The truth about stories is that's all we are." And this is a theme that comes up in a lot of Native American literature, understandably, but it's also hard to think about how to take those storytelling traditions and put them into forms like the novel or any kind of written text, which are things that Europeans bring with them. And so for a while in the 60s and 70s, there were even questions about whether it was authentically Indian. Like if a Native person was writing in English, was it even Native American literature? If they were, printing a novel, was it even Native American literature because it wasn't oral storytelling? And Native writers pushed back really hard on that and pointed out that adaptation has been a huge part of most cultures, and that they have every right to take the English language, to take other languages from Europe, like French and Spanish, and to adapt those languages and those traditions and that literature and use it for themselves. But it's also important to think about oral storytelling and the benefits of oral storytelling, because a lot of times when we talk about oral storytelling, we see it in a Western space. We often frame it as sort of an inferior form or an early form, something that's not as reliable, something that we can really just discard and see as like something that belonged to people who didn't have the good resources we do and who hadn't yet developed a written language. But in fact, there are real benefits of oral storytelling. For one thing, they are flexible and adaptable. So an oral story can be told to suit a particular audience, right? You can tell the story in one way for children, you can tell it in another way for teenagers or adults. You can also tell it in ways that connect it to current events, right? That make commentary on what's going on at that moment in time. You can pick out the parts of the stories that are most important for particular audiences to hear. You can make it more interactive. And so those are things that we really lose when we translate something into print, right? That it becomes fixed, it becomes written forever. In fact, in early contact, when the United States was trying to get Native tribes to sign treaties, many Native people saw that as a real weakness, that the treaties were fixed and couldn't be adjusted to the circumstances, right? So if you think about some of the arguments that we have politically today about things like how to interpret the will of the founding fathers and what the Constitution says and what it means, and what would George Washington have had to say about gun rights in 2021. For Native peoples, it would have been much easier. They would have simply adapted the rules as they went, because the rules wouldn't have been fixed in that same way and they wouldn't have been so rigid. So the other thing that's useful to know is that sometimes we think of, I always hear students say, well, oral stories are unreliable because it's just like playing telephone and people inevitably get it wrong, right? Like they just lose the message over time. But in fact, for many tribal nations, a storyteller was a highly trained individual, someone who was chosen for their specific skill with language and their skill as a storyteller. And they would be put in charge of specific stories, not necessarily all stories, but like some sacred stories would go to specific people within the tribe. And they would be trained by the generation before them. So there are stories about storytellers who had to repeat a story word for word. And if they got one word wrong, they had to go back and start over. And so we're not talking about just like anybody who wanted to spread gossip and then we wrote down whatever was left. We're talking about a really highly specialized tradition of people preserving important information. So again, all of that is really different from writing a novel. And so I hoped going into this project, I really wanted to answer some questions. I wanted to think about what happens when Native authors adapt American literary traditions. What genre conventions do they preserve and what do they change? How do they translate oral storytelling methods into print? And how can non-Native literary techniques preserve and expand Native stories, traditions, and values? So I had these questions in mind. I knew I was going to write something about Native American literature. And then this brings me to the other side of the coin, which is science fiction. So when I first started working on this project, I just knew that I wanted to work with something that was experimental, that was like something to do with a genre. So horror or fantasy or fiction or maybe comics or, something like that. But I decided that I really had to narrow down the scope of what I was working on. And I was especially interested in science fiction at the very beginning, just because some of the most interesting novels I had read were science fiction novels. But I also chose science fiction because it's a genre that's all about change and potential. It's a genre that imagines the world differently, and it encourages readers to do the same. So obviously all literature invites readers to see the world from new perspectives, but science fiction kind of takes this approach to the extreme. And this makes it, I think, a really perfect genre for challenging readers to see the world in new ways. So if you just see these definitions of Indigenous science fiction, or sorry, not Indigenous science fiction, but just of science fiction by science fiction theorists, I'll take a second to read them and then talk a little bit about each one. So Darko Suvin, who is sort of seen as the father of science fiction theory, says that the genre is defined by the presence of what he calls a novum, or a strange newness, which is produced by the interaction of estrangement and cognition. And what he means here is estrangement, it just has to be strange, it has to be unfamiliar, it has to be something that's not part of the world we know, but it has to be cognitive, which means that it has to be explained in a logical or scientific way. It can't be just made up. So for Suvin, this is the difference between science fiction and fantasy. He's really interested in saying that essentially he wants to argue that science fiction is better because it relies on logic, which is a debatable point. But that's kind of his idea. Philip K. Dick, who some of you may be familiar with because he's a really prolific science fiction writer and a lot of his work has been adapted into films. He says that science fiction must create a shock of disrecognition that unlocks the reader's mind so that that mind, like the author's, begins to create. So in each situation here, they're really focusing on the idea that science fiction can introduce something new into the world and that new thing can have an effect on readers. And then finally, John Reeder is interested in sort of how we define the term science fiction in terms of what do we count in the science fiction canon and what do we not count in the canon. And he says that the creation of the genre is a historical process in which categorization is not a passive registering of qualities intrinsic to what is being categorized, but an active intervention in their disposition. So what he's really talking about here is the way that we decide what is science fiction. And he argues that essentially as readers read new books and decide to label them as science fiction, or as publishers or authors label their work as science fiction, that's what changes the genre itself. That's what expands or contracts the shape of the genre, is essentially how readers respond to it. So, so these are all really great and promising ideas, but at the same time, science fiction has a long history of being closely related to colonization. So the theorist Istvan Cicere-Ronay Jr. points out that the nations that are that have produced the most science fiction are precisely those that attempted to expand beyond their national borders in imperialist projects: Britain, France, Germany, Soviet Russia, Japan, and the US. And so he argues that science fiction in many ways is a literature born out of empire, which I think the author Nalo Hopkinson makes a much clearer argument about that connection. She is a Jamaican American writer, excuse me, and she says, one of the most familiar memes of science fiction is that of going to foreign countries and colonizing natives. For many of us, that's not a thrilling adventure story, it's nonfiction, and we are on the wrong side of the strange ship that appears out of nowhere. So there's this idea that for all of the promise of science fiction, it also has a long history of reinforcing the ideals of colonization. And so this all led me to more questions. So you know, what happens when people who have been colonized engage with science fiction tropes? What does science fiction look like when it's reimagined from the perspectives of Indigenous people, as Nalo Hopkinson is encouraging us to do? And how do Native authors preserve and develop their own cultures, traditions, and values when they're in the process of adapting Euro-American tropes and literary traditions? So I could go a whole lot further than that. I'm going to just kind of wrap it up a little bit here and then make more space for conversation and questions. So the reason that I really wanted to look at Indigenous science fiction and that it was worth writing a whole book about is because it allows me to ask all of these questions. And the answers are often complex and different for different authors and different times. But I also really love that the genre itself so clearly refutes popular stereotypes about Native Americans. A lot of the stereotypes that we see reinforced have to do with this idea that Native people are stuck in the past, that, you know, it's really tragic what happened to them, but we wiped them out or we removed them or whatever. And particularly in the Southeast, particularly in Georgia, where there are no federally recognized tribes, it's easy to just not think about them. When I teach Native American literature classes and Native American studies classes, often we have to begin the semester just by letting people know that there are still Native people, that they exist in the present, and that they didn't cease to become Native just because they have adapted and evolved and don't do things exactly the same way that their ancestors did, or don't dress exactly the same way that their ancestors dressed. And so when you have that as sort of what you're working against, then even just the phrase Indigenous science fiction or Native American science fiction challenges that assumption. It immediately lets us know that Native people live in the present, and we can also extend that into the future by thinking about science fiction. And so ultimately, I think because this genre is all about possibility and change, it can give us a way to rethink the past, to imagine a better future, and to change readers' minds in the present. And as a very short example of what I'm talking about, I would like to show you all a video that is truly 1 minute long. And I'm going to have to unshare my screen and reshare it to get to the video. So just a second. Let me get this up. Nope, that won't work. Okay.
And let me know if you need any help, Miriam. I'm happy to.
Thank you. I think I have a plan. Let's see.
Okay.
Here we go.
Great.
Okay. All right. This is Neil Discovers the Moon by Stephen Paul Judd, who is an amazing pop artist. And there's not too much sound. Sorry, let's not do that. Here we go. Okay. All right.
Wow, that was, you're right. It was 1 minute. It was so powerful. Wow.
I'm sorry, I laughed so hard.
Good. That's the point. All right.
I would just like to
unshare this. Yes.
I would
sorry,
just like to say that I really appreciate the time and effort that goes into making a stop motion video. And for 30 seconds to a minute worth of film, that probably took hours to do, and I loved it.
Yeah, that's awesome. That was great.
Yeah, it's
Miriam, okay, first of all, thank you so much. Your talk was just it was so mind-blowing and enlightening. Thank you for sharing all that with us. I truly appreciate it. I know I was just hanging on your every word. So
thank you.
you. We do have some questions that are already loaded into the chat. I feel bad because I already asked one, but I have one that I really wanted to bring, and we don't have to take mine first, but I was just curious about, so many of the science fiction works we have in the Bentley collection, they often overlap with, the dystopian genre, and I was curious about if those themes also appear in Indigenous science fiction, or is that more so connected to the Eurocentric tradition, just, having that dystopian view?
No, absolutely. I think a lot of it, and dystopia is often intended as a critique of the culture it's in, right? And a warning. And in a lot of Indigenous dystopia, I would say it is a critique of Euro-American culture and Western culture. And in many cases, one of the things that I think is so cool is that you end up with traditional Indigenous knowledges and traditional Native ways of being in the world and understanding the world are often the only possible antidote after capitalism has essentially destroyed the world. And so a couple of really great novels that are Indigenous dystopias are, and I'll type these in the chat too, but The Marrow Thieves, if my keyboard works, The Marrow Thieves by Cherie Demeline. She is Métis from Canada, and it's actually a YA novel. It's a beautiful dystopia, and a sequel to it actually just came out that I haven't gotten to read yet. And Louise Erdrich, who is best known for historical fiction, actually published a science fiction novel a couple of years ago called Future Home of the Living God, which is also set in a near future dystopia. And the dystopias tend to be related to climate change, and sort of what happens. It's both what happens to the climate and then what happens to people, and how do people respond when the climate is unsettled. And once there's a scarcity of resources, how quickly we find that the American and Canadian governments revert back to taking things from Native people because they have valuable resources. In The Marrow Thieves, that means literally taking their dreams. In Future Home of the Living God, it has to do with the ability to reproduce. That novel has kind of a lot in common with The Handmaid's Tale, where there's essentially only people of color seem to be able to have healthy babies anymore. So yes, there's absolutely overlap.
Oh, wow. Okay. That's so interesting. On a related note, Tamara asked about, are there parallels or comparisons to be made with the work of Octavia Butler, because we have a nice collection of Miss Butler's works. And so do you have any comment on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I often teach Octavia Butler. I teach a class on race and gender and science fiction, and I teach Octavia Butler alongside some of these Indigenous authors. And so there's certainly, I would say, a similar interest in that critique of capitalism and critique of colonialism and critique of the world that we live in now. And Butler has written in so many different genres and experimented with so many different things. But just off the top of my head, I would say there are also Native vampire novels, in the way that's something that Butler has done. There are also novels set in space in the future that are concerned with questions about resource extraction and how the politics on Earth get reproduced on other planets, which is something that she's interested in. So yeah, there are absolutely connections to be made with Butler.
Oh, wow.
And there are actually, if thinking about something like Kindred, right, where the protagonist travels back in time
Mhm.
and experiences the system of slavery firsthand. One of my favorite Indigenous science fiction novels is called Riding the Trail of Tears. And it's a Cherokee author who imagines, it's not exactly the same setup, but it's a virtual reality game where tourists pay money to virtually travel on the Trail of Tears. And it allows for that same kind of interaction with historical events and historical traumas, and a chance to think about what has happened in the past, and the ways that it's still shaping the lives of people in the present, as well as, you know, the ways that we do and don't talk about those traumas and about what really happened, and the ways that people try to pretend that everything is fine and that we don't need to deal with the past anymore.
That's so interesting. Thank you. And Andrew has two questions. And so I'm going to start. Andrew asked, can similar works be found in groups with similar histories? I don't know how to say that, Andrew.
I knew, right?
I've only read it, so I have no clue how to say it either.
Okay. Miriam said, I knew in Japan. We'll start with that question. Okay. Yeah, we'll see.
I would guess that there would be, but I have to say I do not know nearly enough about Japanese literature. I know that part of the larger politically, the Indigenous rights movement has certainly includes the Ainu. And I'm going to apologize for the noise in the background. My small child just got home. But I don't know for sure if there are works of science fiction by Ainu writers. I should find out.
Great. Thank you, Andrew, for that question. And Andrew also wants to know, while you talked about Indigenous authors adapting European genres, are there any examples of European authors adapting Indigenous genres?
That's a really interesting question. So I think this is where it gets really tricky, because we have to talk about the difference between adaptation and appropriation. So one of the major issues that, this is a great question, but one of the major issues that Indigenous people deal with today is that their culture is often appropriated in ways that it shouldn't be, in ways that are culturally insensitive, or that there's not permission. And so that includes everything from hanging a dream catcher in your car, to dressing up in an Indian costume on Halloween, to doing the tomahawk chop at the World Series. There are a whole host of issues. And there have also been a lot of people, this was particularly prevalent in the 90s, New Agers who tried to adapt Native American religions. But Native peoples are very private about their traditions and their beliefs and their religions. So as opposed to Christianity, which is all about converting more people and welcoming more people in, and that's why it's a religion that relies on missionaries. Native cultures belong only to the specific group of people who are Native religions are intended to be practiced only by the specific group of people who are part of that culture. And Native storytelling works the same way. So there are certain taboos around stories. Some stories can only be told by certain people, or can only be told at certain times of the year, because they're seen as sacred and they have a real power. And if you don't follow the rules, things can go wrong in the world. And so for those reasons, it would probably be seen as inappropriate for a non-Native author to try to adapt those methods, because the argument would be that they don't really totally understand what they're doing. They probably haven't been given permission. They haven't been welcomed in. Now that's different from saying, that there can't be Indigenous characters in science fiction stories, but the hope would be that those characters would be based in some reality, and that the author would consult with people who were from that nation and try to make sure that they were giving an accurate portrayal. If it was film or TV, that they were actually hiring a Native person to play that part. Basically, that they would get it right instead of just making it up. Does that kind of answer your question? It's a really good question.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes. And
can I ask a question?
Oh, yeah, go ahead, Barbara. Yeah.
I'm wondering, the Native American designation in literature, is it based on both author and theme? Can you have a Native author that doesn't qualify in terms of the category of Native literature?
That's such a fun question. So the short answer is, if it's written by a Native author, it's Native no matter what they write about or who they write about. The author, Stephen Graham Jones, I'll put his name in the comments too. He's a Blackfeet writer, and he writes a lot of genre fiction. He writes science fiction, but also horror. He's written a lot, and he also writes what we would consider sort of high literature that gets taught in college classrooms. He argues that forcing Native people to write about themes that are recognizably Native is another way of sort of keeping them, compartmentalizing them, and forcing them to create those same stereotypes over and over again. And so often in his novels, he doesn't give anyone's tribal affiliation, but there have been critics who have argued that every character in a Stephen Graham Jones novel is Native unless they say otherwise. And you don't have to see all of the sort of like check marks to know that they're Native, they just are.
Miriam,
But I would say
just-
it's like an ongoing question, and it's a struggle because I've taught his work in classes where my students have said, well, why are we reading this in a Native American literature class? Because it's not like about Indians. And so it is something that I think we're still trying to figure out how to have those conversations.
So I just want to clarify, sorry, this is Melissa Kell. When you're talking about Native Americans, it's very diverse. There's not a pan-Indian culture really. It's more
Right.
individual tribes have their own cultures. They're all different. And
Exactly.
you just have to understand that there's no, typical Indian.
Exactly. Yeah, the thing that I always tell my students is that there are 576 right now, I think, federally recognized tribes in the United States. And every single one of those groups will have their own language, their own culture, their own history with the United States. There will be some overlap in some places, but they'll be incredibly different from one another.
I have another question. Along those lines, we're speaking about different tribes and nations and the diversity that exists. Miriam, have you noticed that? Is there one group of people that tends to write more in the science fiction genre?
There seem to be a lot of Cherokee science fiction writers. I mean, that's not exclusive. And there also, I think, is more happening in Canada among First Nations peoples. But that's partially because the cultural climate is so different in Canada, because Indigenous peoples in Canada are sort of the largest, most prominent racial minority, and they have a history of the country of Canada has a history of mistreating Indigenous peoples that is at least as bad and sometimes worse as the history in the United States. There's a lot more visibility there, and a lot more, I would say, a lot more open racism, but also a lot more ongoing conversation and a lot more efforts to support Indigenous artists and authors and scholars. And so there's probably a bigger tradition. It's come about more easily in Canada. But in the US, yeah, there have been quite a few Cherokee science fiction novels recently, but it's certainly not exclusive.
And again, I apologize for not knowing this, but I've heard someone before say First Nations. I don't always know with that term. Can you explain that term a little bit?
Right. Sorry, yeah, so First Nations is the term that's used in Canada in the way that we would use American Indian or Native American here. And Indigenous is also still acceptable in Canada. Sometimes you hear Aboriginal, but I think that that's kind of fallen out of favor. So First Nations is probably a slightly more accurate term than Native American because it acknowledges that those peoples existed before Canada. And just the other part of that that's really important is that unlike other racial or ethnic groups. Native people have a political relationship with the US government. They have a nation-to-nation relationship because the United States and England and other European countries signed treaties, nation-to-nation treaties with various groups, and that's the foundation of that federal relationship. And so they are political distinctions, not racial or ethnic or even biological distinctions. So each Native nation has its own government. Many of them have their own land base. That's when we think about reservations, that's what we're talking about. They have their own tribes, their own tribal police, their own courts, their own citizenship rules that they control. And so that's part of what's also reflected in the term First Nations, is that it's the same situation in Canada.
I see. Thank you so much for explaining that. Does anyone else have questions for Miriam? If you think of any, please do put it in the chat. Miriam, I would just like a couple minutes to talk about your upcoming book. And I know you're so excited. So in your book, do you like some of the material that you were so generous to share with us today, does that also appear in the book?
Yes, and so that's the beginning of the book is an introduction that got to be way too long. It's like 50 pages, where I've tried to kind of lay out the theoretical background of what it is to come at science fiction, and to come to science fiction, which is science fiction studies is really its own academic field. And then Native American studies and Native American literature as its own academic field. And what does it mean to put those two things in conversation with each other? How do they speak to each other? How do they not speak to each other? Sort of where are the failures and where are the places where they could really benefit from being in conversation? And so that's kind of what I was getting to today, is I addressed some of the questions that here I just sort of posed as questions. And then I have 4 chapters where each one focuses on a specific science fiction novel as an example of some of the things that you can do in the genre when you have this kind of critical and theoretical lens.
Wonderful. So you said it's coming out next month?
Yes. So it's a little bit of a mystery. It's available to pre-order either on Amazon or from Michigan State University Press. A friend of mine pre-ordered it and her copy actually arrived this week, but I haven't seen it yet. And it still says it's only for pre-order, but it is out there in the world. And it is called Encountering the Sovereign Other, Indigenous Science Fiction.
Oh, that is.
Thank you, Joelle. You're on it.
Yes, that is so exciting. Yay. Okay, well, that is I'm excited because I'm trying to get the pre-order link. Oh, here it is. Okay, I found it. I'm putting the Amazon pre-order link in the chat in case anybody wants to go ahead and do that. It's a long link. Sorry about that. But yay. Oh, that is so exciting. Again, any last minute questions for Miriam? If you think of something that you just have to get answered, Miriam, do you mind if people email me and then I can send the email to you?
Absolutely. Or you can just email me directly. I'm going to put my email address here. I'm fine with that too. And I just want to throw out a last minute plug as the coordinator of Native American and Indigenous Studies. If any of this sounds exciting to you, we would love to have you come take a class. I'm teaching 2 different Native American literature classes in the spring. They're both going to focus on literature of the Native South. One is going to be 19th century literature, and one is going to be 20th and 21st century. And we have an introduction to Native American studies class, and we're very interdisciplinary. So we actually have courses being offered in lots of different departments. So they can fit in for people who have lots of different interests and who are taking lots of different majors. We would always love to see you in a class. Thank you, Joy Ellen, you're on it.
Oh, of course. I am. That is just, thank you so much for putting in a plug for that. So important and so exciting. So glad that KSU is offering that. And thank you, Miriam, for spearheading. I know it's a lot of work and so needed. And we're so appreciative of that. So it is 11 o'clock. And again, that was perfect. I cannot thank you enough. Can we please give Miriam a round of applause? Yay.
Thank you.
Thank you
you
so
all
much
so
for
much for
spending. Well,
taking
it
time.
was amazing. Thank
Well,
you.
I really appreciate it. Thank you all for the great questions too. It's always fun to talk about this stuff, not just be alone in my head.
Absolutely. Wonderful. And just if it's your first time, this is a weekly program. So if you liked what you saw today, feel free to email me and I can add you to the listserv. I never add anyone to the listserv unless they specifically ask me to do that. So please do email rarebooks@kennesaw.edu, or you can email me as well, jfree110@kennesaw.edu. If you'd like to be added to our listserv, and all of our programs are recorded and are uploaded to YouTube. So again, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you, Miriam, for speaking, and I will see you all hopefully next week. Bye, everybody.